we can ask this question, what then is the day of the Lord like? And I think this is amazing. This is the point where you're going to go, well, that's the world we live in, isn't it? That's the world we live in. What is the day of the Lord like? Let's talk about the nature of the day of Yahweh. Joel 3, look at verses 9 through 11. Proclaim this among the nations, prepare for holy war. Rouse the warriors, let the men of war advance and attack. Beat your plows into swords and your pruning knives into spears. Let even the weakling say, I am a warrior. Come quickly, all you surrounding nations. Gather yourselves, bring down your warriors there, Lord. All right, here's the first thing. What is the day of the Lord like? It is like war in the entire world. Is that the world we live in? Do we live in a world where it seems like if every time you turn the news on, that there's a war in another place in the Middle East, in the East, in the South, and doesn't it seem like that? Is this characteristic of the world that we live in, that there is war in the entire world? I think it's obvious that it is. And during this time of partial hardening of Israel, when the Gentiles are being gathered into the kingdom, Jesus says that during this time there will be war and rumors of war. Look at Mark 13:7. And I realize that a lot of people want to place this statement of Jesus as being future to us. But I just think it's obvious that it's not in this context. Mark 13:7, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. These things must take place, yet it is not the end. We talk about wars and rumors of wars sometimes in what we call eschatology, which is the study of the end times, as if there's going to be some great time of war that comes future. But notice how Jesus words this. He says, when you hear of it, don't be alarmed. Like if Jesus was warning us about some great future war that was going to happen in a moment, that it was going to get kicked off and happen in a moment, then that's alarming. That it would identify that the return of Christ is near. But Jesus isn't talking about that. He's saying, look, during this time, this day of the Lord, you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. And he is saying exactly the opposite of what popular Christian media portrays with this. He is saying, do not be alarmed. But what did you see on the news? What did you see on the news when Israel was attacked? All of Christendom was alarmed. I want you to see that we are not a church that is built on the hype and the alarm of things happening in the world. This is exactly what was promised to happen by the prophet Joel 2,500 years ago. Jesus reminded us 2,000 years ago that this is what the day of the Lord is like, that there are wars and rumors of wars. It is, and that, yeah, thank you for getting ahead of me. Jamie's like, that's my next note. Yet it is not the end. Yet it is not the end. Why shouldn't you be alarmed when you hear about wars and rumors of wars? Because it's not the end. Because your job as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, to go and gather God's people from the nations, that is still front and center. There is not a day when you go, well, this is the end, I guess I'm going to stop preaching the gospel. No. It doesn't matter what happens in the world. Jesus said, yet it is not the end. Wars and rumors of wars are not a sign that the end will come. They are not. There's something that for whatever reason gets Christians all excited and distracts us from the mission that is laid before us. But Jesus said, yet it is not the end. It is not the end. Do not be alarmed. And so don't be alarmed. Jesus saw something the same as Joel. He says, so he almost like Jesus had read Joel. He probably had, right? International war. It's part of God's purpose to judge the world and to bring the Gentiles into God's kingdom so that all Israel will be saved. That's what this is about. And so there's war in the whole world. Second, there is violence for everyone. Violence for everyone. Look back what he says. He says, beat your plows into swords and your pruning knives into spears. Let even the weakling say, I am a warrior. You understand what that means? That means that, so listen, we have seen, I feel like I've seen this very much in my generation, what I would call a professionalization of militia. That everybody knows there's war in the world, but for some reason we think that means there are trained soldiers fighting with trained soldiers. You know, in my lifetime, the very first moment where that was made real for me, and I've heard people say this about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I wasn't there for that. But the very moment was on 9/11 when I woke up and I turned on the TV. I wasn't even getting ready for work yet, and I turned on the TV and I saw that a plane had crashed into the Twin Towers. And that was the very first moment. That was the first time when I experienced a large-scale attack on not professional militia. That they didn't crash a military plane into a military base. They crashed a civilian plane into a building full of thousands of civilians, and thousands of people died. You understand that's not very different than what just happens to Israel. The point of that was that it was not a professional military attack. It was not professional militia fighting against professional militia. And you go, yes, that's the atrocity of the thing. If we have to fight, can't we be civilized about it? Let even the weakling say, I am a warrior, Joel says. Let even the weakling say. Nobody's exempt from this. Violence is for everyone. Now, I want to point you to something interesting because you may have noticed some of the wording and gone, hey, Joel said that backwards. Look at this comparison. If you have your slides in front of you, you have a comparison between Joel 3:10 and Isaiah 2:4, which is then quoted, mind you, by Micah 4:3. Micah quotes Isaiah, which I just think is brilliant. But Joel says, looking at the coming day of the Lord, he says, beat your plows into swords and your pruning knives into spears. In other words, take all of your agricultural stuff that you use when the world is at peace, right? Because when the world's at peace, what are we doing? We're just building the economy and we're making stuff and we're celebrating life and we're doing good things if the world is at peace, right? But then he says, now take all of your peacemaking things and turn them into weapons of war and violence. Beat your plows into swords and your pruning knives into spears. But then what does Isaiah say? And Micah, who quotes him, he says, he's looking to the end of the day of the Lord. Joel's talking about the beginning, and Isaiah and Micah are looking at the end, and they say he will settle disputes among the nations and provide arbitration for many people. They will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not take up sword against nation, and they will never train for war again. Joel's looking at the beginning of the day of the Lord. Isaiah's looking at the end. Joel is looking at the beginning of the judgment and the destruction that happens in this era that we're in. Isaiah's looking at the end and saying, at the end, we're going to turn it all back into agricultural tools that are necessary in times of peace. That this is a period of time, and at the end, it gets flipped over and it gets made right again. And I think that's so important that we understand the day of the Lord is a period of time where God is working out his judgment. And yes, it comes to a culmination in the end. But that when you see war in the world, when you see violence, I want you to understand that God is using it to purify and to sanctify this world. That it is God's working out of judgment on this world. That you don't look at war in the world and become distraught and despair over it. We can't do that as Christians. Because God has something greater for us. We don't despair and wonder where God is in that because he has already explained to us in the Bible why it is happening. And so we are not people of despair. Instead, we see that and we say, okay, but God has given us a mission to the nations. He has given us a mission to the nations. We remember Jesus' words. These things must take place, but do not be alarmed. It is not yet the end. And we stick to the mission that God has given us to take the gospel to the nations, to gather God's people from all nations because he loves his people. He loves Israel. And we are to gather them. The third thing And this is the beautiful moment. If you think this is all very dark, what is the Lord's day like? It's like war, it's like violence, and it is like refuge for God's people. It is like refuge for God's people. God's elect are protected in the day of the Lord's judgment. Look at verses 14 through 16. Multitudes in the valley of decision. It's talking about war in the land. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and moon will grow dark, and the stars will cease the shining. The Lord will roar from Zion and make his voice heard from Jerusalem. Heaven and earth will shake, but the Lord will be a refuge for his people, a stronghold for the Israelites. Look at that first part. The Lord roars from Zion. What is Zion? People will say, oh, Zion is the mountain of God in Jerusalem. It's the mountain that the temple used to be built on, right? Well, okay. But I love in the Second Temple literature, especially in the book of Enoch, you get this picture of Zion that's a little bit different than just thinking about a physical mountain and a physical land on earth. And you get this picture of Zion where there's 7 mountains. And the center mountain is the highest. They create like a pyramid. And the center one is the highest. And it's on that center mountain that the throne of God rests. And down from the mountains, it opens up into a green, lush, thriving valley. Or you could say a garden or a paradise. And it's a picture of the Garden of Eden, but in heavenly places. It's effectively a picture of where Christ has ascended to the right hand of the Father and where he sits enthroned on high and where he rules on all things. So when Joel says that the Lord roars from Zion, he's talking about Christ's voice being proclaimed from his throne room in the heavens. And that's effectively what's happening here. That's why he can say that his voice is heard from Jerusalem. This isn't talking about Jerusalem on earth. This is talking about from God's heavenly city, that Christ's voice is heard. And how do we hear Christ's voice? How do we hear it? How does the voice of the Lord speak to the world? He proclaims through his people, through the church. What have you been called to do, church? To go and to proclaim the good news to all people. The message of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. To gather the nations. To disciple them. To teach them all that Christ has commanded and to baptize them. That is our commission as the church, is it not? And that's what's been laid before us. And so the Lord roars from Zion through you, his church. His voice is heard from Jerusalem through you, his church. And through you, his church, the Lord will be a refuge for his people, a stronghold, still in the time of war and violence, like we live now. But we are protected in it. And this is why you see the early church in the scriptures. And at many points, for all the mistakes the church has made throughout history, at many points throughout church history, we see pockets of this happening where the church just loves the people. Where the church is about love for people, where we gather together and we say, that even though the world is difficult out there, that at least we can gather and take refuge together. And in the church in Jerusalem, in Acts 2 and in Acts 4, we see this beautiful picture of people, sacrificing property and everything else and to take care of those who are in need in the Jerusalem church. And it's this closeness, and it's because it doesn't matter what's happening in the world around us. As the church, the assembly of Christ's people, we find refuge in him.